Her steps echo through the stone corridors, each one bringing her closer to death. The morning is cold, the air thick with the weight of history. She had once been the queen. Now she's about to be executed in the very castle where she had reigned. The executioner stands in the distance, a silhouette against the overcast sky, waiting. The crowd is hushed. Whispers spread through the air like smoke. Their former queen, bound in chains, is led towards her doom. Timidly, she tells the executioner, "I pray you dispatch me quickly." Then she asks, "Will you take it off before you lay me down?" It meaning her head. The masked man kindly assures her he will not. She takes one last look at the sky, then blindfolds herself. Unable to find the block, she fumbles awkwardly and begs for help. Out of pity, one of the guards guides her to the place she must lay her neck and draw her final breaths. The last words she utters are the final words of Christ. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe falls, the crowd stirs. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, is dead. At just 16 years old, Jane was forced to become Queen of England, a young woman barely past childhood, who was used as a pawn in a ruthless game of politics. Jane never asked for the crown, never sought the throne that she would only sit on for 9 days. She certainly never thought her life would end on the execution block outside the Tower of London. Why was she here? Why did this young queen, a girl who never sought power, find herself facing this moment? Was it truly her fault? Or was she simply the unfortunate victim of a game that had already been lost before she even knew the rules? Welcome to History Snob. Born in October 1537, Lady Jane Grey was the daughter of Henry Grey, the first Duke of Suffolk, and Frances Brandon, granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor. Jane's birth, while tying her to the royal bloodline, did not immediately place her in the line of succession. Her cousin Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was next in line to inherit the throne. Jane's family, though noble, had no reason to believe that the crown would ever fall to her. But Jane wasn't born into a life of idle luxury. Her parents, especially her mother, placed more value on her education than anything else. From an early age, Jane was exposed to some of the best minds of the day. She mastered Latin and Greek with ease, studied the Bible in depth, and was immersed in classical philosophy. Unlike other young women of her rank, who were taught the art of courtly behaviour and marriage, Jane was taught to think. She was trained to understand the world and the politics that often shaped it. Yet this exceptional mind would become both a blessing and a curse. She was perceived as a tool, a key piece in a political game that she never fully understood. But her education, her brilliance, made her someone worth pursuing. She didn't want power, but power came knocking at her door. In 1553, King Edward VI, the only surviving son of Henry VIII, lay on his deathbed. Edward's health had always been fragile, and now, at the early age of 15, his body could no longer sustain him. His death would set off a political firestorm, one that would lead to the swift rise of Lady Jane Grey to the throne. But how? Why Jane? Henry VIII had created the Protestant Church of England so that he could divorce or execute his wives as the situation required. Edward, fearing the return of Catholicism under his Catholic half-sister Mary, had no heirs of his own. Desperate to preserve the Protestant reforms that he and his father had fought for, he altered the line of succession. In his will, Edward bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, in favour of his cousin Jane, who was a devout Protestant. But Jane had no desire for the throne. She was a young girl, brilliant but terrified at the thought of ruling. She had always preferred the quiet life of a scholar to the courtly intrigues that defined royalty. Yet her bloodline made her too valuable to ignore. Edward's Protestant advisors, led by the powerful Duke of Northumberland, saw in Jane a way to maintain their grip on power, and so the decision was made. On July 10, 1553, Jane was crowned Queen of England. But this wasn't a coronation of triumph or choice, it was a coronation driven by politics. The Duke of Northumberland, who hoped to control Jane through her marriage to his son, Guildford Dudley, was the true architect of her rise. He used Jane, much as he used her family, as a stepping stone to secure his own power. But Jane, the 16-year-old girl thrust into the deadly game, had no experience, no power of her own. She was, at best, a pawn in the hands of men who were far more ambitious than she was. Jane might have become queen, but she never wanted to wear the crown. And in the blink of an eye, her world shifted. The very forces that elevated her to power would soon be used against her. As a matter of fact, the whole thing was just a deception from the beginning. Edward's advisors hid the king's death for a full 4 days. I guess they just did a weekend at Bernie's thing until the body began to fall apart. Gross. In reality, they were desperate to keep Mary, who was away from London, from finding out her half-brother was dead. Information travelled slowly in the pre-modern world, and knowledge is power. Northumberland and his allies needed time to get their new Protestant queen on the throne before Mary could gather support. 4 days after her cousin's death, a group of nobles unceremoniously burst in and informed Jane that she was now the Queen of England. She initially refused, but her parents, her father-in-law Northumberland, and her husband Guildford won her over. But here's the real question. Are you actually in charge if no one accepts you? In the eyes of the public, Jane was not a true monarch. No one knew who she was and no one cared. Mary was the daughter of their beloved former king. Even to many Protestants, it didn't matter that Mary was Catholic. She was obviously the rightful queen. When Jane was proclaimed as queen to the people of London, the announcement was met with an eerie silence and uncomfortable murmuring. The announcement of a new ruler is usually a cause for celebration, but Jane's new subjects seemed to sense what was coming. On the very day Jane was crowned, a letter arrived from Mary, announcing that she was the rightful queen and demanded loyalty. Despite the weekend at Bernie's routine, she knew exactly what was going on. Within days, Mary had gathered an army 20,000 strong. Northumberland had sent a fleet of warships to keep Mary from fleeing by sea. Instead, they defected to her, adding their cannons to her cause. It was now clear to Northumberland that he was in deep trouble. He gathered as many men as he could, about 1,500, and marched out to raise more troops to confront Mary. Jane tried to insist that her father should lead the resistance, but it was clear no one cared much what their supposed queen ordered. Her father-in-law Northumberland only wanted her as a puppet. Almost as soon as Jane became queen, her husband Guildford began begging her to make him king. When Jane refused, Guildford's mother forbade him to share her bed. Northumberland's tiny army didn't attract popularity, and it didn't get far before news started coming in that Jane's supporters were defecting left and right. Privy councillors, members of the cabinet basically, who had welcomed Jane just day before, were now begging Mary's forgiveness. Jane's own father fled to the Tower of London and proclaimed his support for Mary. Northumberland found himself trapped in the city of Cambridge. He appeared in the town square, gaunt and weeping, and announced publicly that he too recognised Mary as queen. But none of that could save him now. He and his supporters were arrested and marched back to London. Reportedly, Mary's guards had a hard time protecting him from the angry mob. On July 19th, 1553, just 9 days after her coronation, Jane was officially deposed, as all her former supporters proclaimed Mary queen. Mary entered London in triumph. The Duke of Northumberland was swiftly executed, and Jane found herself imprisoned in the Tower of London with her husband Guildford. It was about as low a fall as could be imagined, but in fact, Jane still had an ace up her sleeve. Jane and all her primary conspirators were put on trial for treason and quickly found guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. Jane had signed several documents as Jane the Queen, which was proof enough that she was a usurper. She was sentenced to death by burning or beheading at Mary's pleasure. Burning was the typical punishment for female traitors at the time. But Jane wrote a letter to Queen Mary, her cousin, apologising and attempting to explain all that had happened. Amazingly, given her bloody reputation, Mary refused to execute Jane and Guildford. She fully understood that they had been manipulated into seizing the throne and didn't blame them for it at all. The two were kept prisoner in the Tower of London, but Jane was allowed to walk in the gardens. It was a kind of honourable confinement. All this would change though in January of 1554, when Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain provoked a minor rebellion. Jane obviously wasn't involved, but some of Guildford's family were. It became clear to Mary that as long as Jane lived, she would always be a threat because Protestants could always conspire to restore her power. On January 19, 1554, Mary reluctantly signed Jane and Guildford's execution orders. Jane wouldn't go to the block for her supposed crimes, but because, as a symbol, she was just too dangerous to live. On the morning of February 12, 1554, the last day of her life, Jane watched from the window in the Tower of London as her husband was led to the execution block. She had refused a final meeting with him the day before because it was just too painful. Now she looked on from afar as the axeman took his head, exclaiming, "Oh, Guildford, Guildford!" Then it was her turn to be led to the same grisly fate. Despite the brevity of her reign, Lady Jane Grey's legacy has endured. For centuries she's been portrayed as the ultimate victim, an innocent girl caught in a deadly Game of Thrones. But was she really just a pawn, or did she have more agency in her fate than history gives her credit for? Some historians believe that there could have been a very different life had she not been thrust into the political maelstrom of the Tudor court. Could she have become a stronger ruler had her reign lasted longer? Her intellect, her political connections, and her sense of duty might have allowed her to lead England in a different direction. Instead, she became a tragic symbol of what might have been. Another theory, gaining some traction, is that Jane's story is one of lost opportunity. Perhaps Jane could have led England down a more peaceful path, one without the bloodshed of Mary's reign. What we do know is that Jane, as queen for only 9 days, represents a symbol of lost potential and what happens when a young woman is caught up in a game that was never hers to play. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story of Lady Jane Grey and her tragic, brief reign, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. What do you think? Was Jane a victim of her time? Or could she have fought for a different destiny? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning the past. You might be surprised by the answers. This is History Snob, signing off.